Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again. This is another in our series of vulnerability analysis videos from the Virsec Security Lab. I'm joined, as always, by Satya Gupta, our founder and CTO. Hello, Satya. How are you?
Very well. How are you doing, Willie?
Good. So more craziness in the world of cyber attacks. We're changing our format a little bit. Rather than going through a series of vulnerabilities, we're going to tackle some big ones that have been in the news all around Microsoft Exchange servers. If you remember, Microsoft Exchange seemed to be part of both the SolarWinds attack and the Centrion attack. And now there's been announcements that as many as 30,000 organizations might be vulnerable to these significant gaps. So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into it. We've got some technical diagrams in terms of our understanding and our lab's recreation of how this probably occurred. And we'll also be producing a demo in the next few days. So Satya, why don't you give us the overview of what's been happening here and what we know?
Yes, absolutely. So very early this month, on the 2nd of March, 7 new vulnerabilities were exposed. So 3 of them had been are sort of been identified with source insight, and the other 4 are some unknown attack group. They were basically zero-day attacks and now, of course, it's public news that a Chinese group called Hafnium, or who's been called Hafnium by Microsoft, has been exploiting these vulnerabilities in the wild for a while, looks like. And so these 4 vulnerabilities that the Hafnium team has been exploiting is, I can basically bin them into 3 different categories. So number 1 would be Ssrf vulnerability, which basically what it does is it allows a user who's sending a crafted request to the Exchange server, they can identify themselves as so because of the vulnerability, the Exchange server basically returns back a token which is associated with the privileges of admin. So in other words, now for all practical purposes, the attacker has privileges of the admin. They have the security token. So the next request that they send, they can actually use that information to bury that token in there, and the Exchange server wouldn't know that it is not the admin but somebody else who's kind of pretending to be the admin. So once the second request goes in, it has so that brings me to the second vulnerability. That is the deserialization vulnerability. So what that attack is all about is that the attacker sends this specially crafted serialized data. And in that is embedded a RCE. So there's something that will execute on that Exchange server, and you can actually plant and in return you get system privileges, which is the highest level of privileges that you can get. So you can actually, when you have system privileges, you can do really crazy things. Even processes that are very Microsoft specific processes, the init process and the LSAS process, which has all kinds of creds in it. They will all get, somebody with that privilege can read all those process memory. And so, everything is off the table at that point. You can really get very deep into the system. You pretty much own the box at that point in time. You can choose to keep on extracting stuff, confidential material out of it, or you could completely, own the box and turn it into a brick if you wanted to do that. That's the power of the system privileges, essentially. So once you've got these...
Sorry to interrupt. A couple things that seem to be kind of common themes here. Maybe if I can draw a through line from SolarWinds and some of these others and now. First of all, nation-state attackers seem to be, Russia, China. It's probably not limited to that, but well-funded, large organizations, constantly changing what they're doing. That seems to be a common thread here. Also, you mentioned remote code execution. We've heard a lot about that in various attacks. And then the fact that it seems like conventional tools have not been catching this either at the perimeter or detecting it afterwards with enormous dwell times. Are those all fair to say?
Absolutely. And, as we all discussed previously, these other tools, the conventional EDR type solutions, they're looking for behavioral, telltale clues, essentially. And, they kind of associate a certain malware with a certain set of behavior patterns and all that. And if you don't have any knowledge about that particular new malware that got created, there's obviously stands to reason that you cannot really identify if that particular application is active and is performing malicious actions. So, until somebody publishes the indicators of compromise, you're kind of blindsided. In this particular case, a company called Volexity and has published. They were called in to do almost like a 911 operation on that. So they were able to identify some signatures, the signatures for the file, signatures for some telltale aspects of this attack. But now I have to tell you, the attackers are salivating at this kind of behavior because, they just have to make a small tweak and everybody thinks that they have a good protection built in out there. But, all the attacker has to change is a comma in their, in their code, and, the signature is completely, 100% different and all. So,
very good at modifying in multiple variants and, changing it thousands of times over. So
exactly
requiring prior knowledge just seems like a losing proposition.
Totally incorrect. It's like that arcade game that we keep talking about, right? You kill one,
whack-a-mole, yeah.
Yes. So that's the very losing strategy, as we've discussed many times before. And so, what happened with this particular case is that the RC basically ended up creating a reverse channel back into the attacker's command control center. And now from there, because they had elevated privileges, admin privileges, they were able to drop any kind of file. What they chose to do here was they were able to drop a web shell on an Exchange server runs on a well-known server called the IIS information server that is used by Microsoft a lot. It's a very traditional application server that hosts a whole bunch of Microsoft products and all. So the IIS server was actually the attackers used some ASPX files, which is basically a .NET file that dropped on the server, and then that got included into the functionality of the IIS server. So now the attackers are able to send requests to that particular web shell, and the web shell, based on what you send out there, is able to perform a whole bunch of command injection type operations and extract all kinds of information from that box and send it back. So you can run any PowerShell command.
Right, taking ownership over the whole Exchange server.
Totally, yeah.
You think place to have a hacker have ownership.
Totally. That box is completely owned. It has the highest privileges. You can run. The attacker can run arbitrary code on it, and so you just don't know about it, but you don't own the box anymore.
Right. So maybe Satya, can you step us through the diagrammatic view here and step by step of what you were describing?
Absolutely. Let me share my screen here. So, this is a sequence diagram that we put together. On the left-hand side is the attacker, which has been called the Hafnium group. So what they do is they'll first send, a malicious request, as we discussed, with, they don't really have the creds, but because of that vulnerability in the Microsoft Exchange server, they are able to take advantage of a Ssrf server-side request forgery flaw in the application logic. And then that flaw basically gets exploited, and the admin tokens are sent back to the Hafnium attacker, essentially on the Hafnium side. So this is our initial infiltration and exploitation phase. And then once the attacker has the security token, what they do next is really very interesting. They'll send malformed serialized data to the Exchange server, which basically allows them to escalate privileges, but also execute some code on the server. So now once that code is executed, it basically ends up creating a whole bunch of things. But one notable thing is that it establishes a reverse shell back to the Hafnium attacker, essentially. And so next, the attacker basically uses that reverse shell to launch various processes and various commands and perform some reconnaissance and looking for things like looking for new or elevated password, people's passwords, essentially. And looking for other critical data. Who knows what they'll find, kind of thing, right? So they're looking around, performing, snooping around, trying to look for this, look for that. And when they find everything that's that looks interesting to them, they will zip it and they'll send it back to their command control center. Then the next stage is the real exfiltration stage, where they can actually now drop a web shell because they have admin privileges, as we saw in step number 4. They had gained privileges, so they ended up dropping a web shell on the IIS server, and then the web shell will execute like a normal HTTP request is sent to the web shell. The web shell does whatever it is that is being asked for in that OS command that the attacker wants to be able to run. They're able to run a whole bunch of PowerShell commands. They can snoop at pretty much any process and go and read the memory, use proc dump and tools like those to and run mimikatz and all that kind of all the possibilities are endless here at that point.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that that they're looking for gets encrypted and sent back to their command control center. That's in step 14. So
just a couple thoughts here. The reconnaissance, normally you think of that as being the first stage where they're snooping around, but this is with system privilege, right? So kind of privileged reconnaissance. They can pretty much see everything, right?
In many ways, reconnaissance can be described at 2 levels, right? I'm kind of doing a recon on what do I attack? Is this a server that I want to attack or not? That's one stage of reconnaissance. But in this, we're now already inside the box. Now they're surveying, what else can I snatch and grab out here? And that's another level of reconnaissance, essentially.
And I would believe that an Exchange server would have a huge amount of valuable data, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, the entire enterprise's emails can be exposed here if the attacker wants to look at that. They can actually extract a whole bunch of very valuable business information and, who knows what the organization is, the folks inside the organization are talking about, so sure. A lot of the business and all the, code and all kinds of information can get compromised.
And as we saw with SolarWinds, they were able to do spear phishing based on kind of insider information and insider email addresses, things like that.
Yes. So it's, we've said repeatedly, Willie, that, once you let the burglar inside your home and there's no, oversight on that burglar, who knows what the burglar will do, right? So, all bets are off at that point. You should expect the worst. If there's a smart burglar, which a lot of these nation state attackers are all about, they will, they will be very, very precise and very, mercenary about what they do, essentially.
This seems like letting the burglar in your house and having the code to your alarm system on a Post-it sitting on it.
So, exactly. Effectively, they've turned it off and there's nobody coming to your help.
Right. So let's talk about where Virsec can detect and stop some of these steps.
Right. So, so these are, several places where Virsec will stop the attack. It, this RCE, when a piece of malware will want to run, that will absolutely get blocked by Virsec. So, at step 6, end of story out there. None of these other subsequent steps will actually occur out there. And then, but let's say for a moment, just for argument's sake, let's, put that aside for a moment. Then, another opportunity for Virsec to jump in is when, the reconnaissance steps are being made. Those are all PowerShell scripts and all that, are not authorized to run on those boxes. So those reconnaissance steps and 9 and 9 here will get blocked, absolutely. And then, this critical data that it gets zipped is using some tools like 7-zip or some other, tarring facility, some tool that performs tar. So that can be actually, that's something that you can make sure that, that doesn't get to run on the server. So Virsec's ACP policy, application control policies will pick up all of that and terminate those steps as well. And then let's assume for a moment, that's just for argument's sake, this doesn't really going to happen, but, just for an argument's sake, if let's say the ACP policy doesn't kick in at step number 10, then, at step number 13, where, the user drops a web shell, that's a new file that gets written on the disk and all, that will get detected and blocked. And potentially a protection action would be that, to move this particular file out of the web root so that the attacker doesn't get to run anything. So in that case, once the file is gone, then step 14 is also automatically disabled. So step 13 and 14 both can be stopped. Step 10 and step 6 are the 4 places we can stop the attack, essentially, without any knowledge base, without any knowing anything at all about the application or the signature and all. It's not, as you know, Virsec's attacks are not contingent on any indicator of compromise or signature. It's really contingent of, on is this code that is running, did it come from a developer or did it come from an attacker?
And this follows our kind of the zero trust model that people have been talking about in depth, right? Where rather than looking at what's possibly bad coming in, we're just making sure we're guardrailing all of these steps. If any illicit code is running, we can detect it and stop it immediately.
Absolutely. So the principle of zero trust is, you don't trust anything, right? So what is coming in is basically data that's coming in from an attacker. And, when the application consumes it, turns into poison and it tips over and lets the attacker gain control, and then the attacker owns that box. So, one of the things that happened at step 6 was that the attacker was able to push some really bad, nasty malware through step 6. And so, as soon as the attacker attempted to run that particular, remote code that they dropped in there, that would get picked up. So that's really important that, when when attacker provided data turns into code, that is the moment of inflection where, it's like the seminal moment where all hell will break loose, and we detect those kind of situations where the attacker's data cannot be trusted anymore and it turns into code. That's what zero trust is all about, and that's what Virsec is all about.
Sure, and quite unique in having this visibility and control during runtime, right?
Absolutely. And this requires the deepest level of application awareness. You have to be able to look at the code, every line of code, and be able to watch and be able to tell, who provided this piece of code. Did it come from a developer or did it come from an attacker?
And, reading through like the NIST zero trust documents and others, it's a common statement that assume the attackers are already inside, which I guess means that assume that half of the perimeter security that exists has already failed. And I guess we can add on that, assume maybe the attackers are inside and may have been dwelling for long periods of time. So stopping this in runtime as they execute bad code seems to be critical.
Absolutely. And, we're not, with this new innovation and with these application aware controls, you don't have to live with that assumption anymore. We are basically, the attacker gets into your enterprise through the millions of vulnerabilities that exist in your code, essentially, in your public facing code. And it's really, really difficult to be able to shut those things down. So if you have an application aware protection solution like Virsec, it'll make sure that it makes it horrendously difficult for the attacker to be able to get into your enterprise in the very first place. So, it's like, we've talked about this in the past. It's, a vulnerable application is like hanging a lock on your door, which as you breathe on that lock, it kind of gives up on you. So, this is where, with Virsec running, protecting that lock, it's not going to be easy to break in anymore. So that is the big difference. Then any new attackers will not necessarily go in, and any attackers that are on the inside will not be able to execute arbitrary code on any endpoint. So effectively, we've neutered the attacker essentially.
And of course, we're only showing vulnerabilities here that have been disclosed. So there may be, 10x the number that have not been disclosed or not been, but are being exploited. So the ability to stop that bad behavior, regardless of what vulnerability is causing it, seems to be essential here.
Absolutely. Just a very sobering thought here. Almost like 25,000 vulnerabilities get exposed, currently that get written out into the National Vulnerability Database. And many people believe that, the number is actually many times more because, as a nation state attacker, I'm under no obligation to go and deposit or to go and convey to National Vulnerability Database, hey, I found a vulnerability in such and such application. The goals and the objectives of nation state attackers are very, very different from white hat, hackers whose sort of motivation is to help improve the applications that are being used by the public. They don't have, nation state attackers don't have that, utopian kind of an attitude where they'll, their goals are to go and grab and snatch as much as they can before you discover them.
Yeah, and there seems to be, maybe I'm speculating a bit, but last year we had this whole wave of ransomware attacks, and those seem more like almost kind of vandalism. I mean, I know they can be serious and costly, but this seems to be at a different level, whether it's the Chinese or the Russians, where it appears that stealing data is the goal. And
Exactly.
supposedly the Hafnium group has been organized around stealing intellectual property from companies. So that should also be sobering.
Absolutely, and this whole notion about creating like a profile for every human is very ambitious. But now with all these vulnerabilities, it is entirely possible to be able to do that. And the idea is that you build enough data about every individual, so you can compromise them when the time comes. You can actually use that information to compromise them completely. And it's very troubling in a thought process that they say that there are these claims in the dark web that everybody has a profile for them. Supposedly the Chinese have profiles for everybody, and they can trace your behavior patterns very, very easily.
So the last point I just wanted to reinforce, back to zero trust. I think zero trust has a bad reputation of being very difficult to do in practice. It sounds like a good idea, but if you're, and it's mostly been viewed as a kind of an access control thing for users and devices and networks. But I think it's critical here. Everything that Virsec does, the application awareness, is automated, right? There's no tuning or tweaking or manual intervention. And that seems like the only way we're going to make this work at scale.
Yes. And, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, there's if I give you a binary for an application, there's tons of information, living in that binary or the package, that you might give me. I can extract so much information out of it that, this is where the application awareness comes from. I can just simply decompose the application without asking a user a single question. I can extract, all the executables. I can find out all the checksums of all the executables of that the developer released. I can find out all libraries that a given executable will load. I can find out what processes, which files will get loaded into memory at runtime. I can pretty much find where all the sockets that the application will connect to and all. So and I can establish what we call the control flow. How an application will execute. It's like almost like a Google map. It basically says that you'll take road number 1 for 5 miles and then turn left onto road number 2 kind of thing, so you can create all that linkages. So, we pretty much, the developer's intent can be extracted and captured. We call those, databases as our app maps. And there's 10 of those very highly precise app maps that we are able to maintain about the application. And without asking the user a single question, without asking them for source code, or all of this is extractable from just the binaries that the developer releases.
Right, and for the audience, we have multiple webinars where we go into depth on that whole process. Well, good, Satya. Any other closing thoughts here that where do you see this going? More of the same?
So we've talked of the power of the RCE out here, right? So if you look at step 6, this is where everything, all hell started breaking loose. So for me, it's a really, it's not so much about the Microsoft, vulnerability, but it's about any vulnerability that has, potential for RCE. The end result will be pretty much be the same. The attacker gets in, then they perform all kinds of, malicious actions after that, like we saw. They can extract, they can perform reconnaissance inside and steal. And what makes this particular attack a little bit nastier than the other RCE attacks is because it, the attacker has been able to get system privileges. That makes it, in the other attacks that you might have seen, we didn't have step 9 out there, where you could actually get into the memory of elevated privilege processes and steal passwords and all. But that is being made possible because the RCE runs at with system privileges essentially. So if I were to summarize, I would say any vulnerability that has an RCE associated with it, be aware, be very wary, and be very, very careful about that. If you do not use application-aware workload protection kind of tools out there, then you're almost like playing Russian roulette with your own infrastructure.
All right, I think we'll leave it at that, Satya. Obviously, we will continue to analyze as more news becomes available or other exploits happen. Unfortunately, all indications are this is going to continue to be an epic year in terms of large-scale vulnerabilities and really requiring, really rethinking our security model in many ways. Thanks again, Satya. And we also, stay tuned, we'll be producing a live demo. Our research lab specializes in recreating these vulnerabilities. And we will be demonstrating a live vulnerability probably within a few days. Thanks again, Satya, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
Thank you.